Hello, everyone. Today on the podcast is Everett Worthington. He is a scholar of forgiveness, a psychological scientist, been investigating it for years, pioneered a host of different studies across the globe. And I had him on and was looking forward to digging into the science of forgiveness, but I didn't anticipate something rearranging how I think about my own relationships. In the prep for this conversation, I read a host of his different articles, and he points out that you can forgive someone completely and still feel rage every single time you see them or think about them, and that's not a contradiction. It's what shows up in the science. So when we sat down, unpacking his career of forgiveness, I discovered he didn't just learn this as an academic discipline. He learned it the hard way through the murder of his mother, the grief he had when his brother took his own life, and he was able to share those stories along with the wealth of psychological science and really open things up for me, and I hope for you. He ends up splitting forgiveness in two different ways: the decision to forgive and then that emotional part that won't lie still. Anyway, it is a fascinating and important conversation, and not just that, I think it actually helps us think through what's going on at the kind of tribal canceling intensity that's kind of rampant in our culture today, exacerbated by technology. Underneath the toxicity growing in our culture are these psychological mechanisms about who we are, what is safe, how we understand ourselves, and they're all at play in the larger public square down to those intimate relationships at home. It was a real treat to get to talk to Everett, as you're about to discover, and I hope you dig this conversation. All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am excited today because I'm getting to talk to Everett Worthington, who is a scholar, works in the psychological sciences, and has been a part of a large project thinking about a really important topic: forgiveness. Something that, well, it would be pretty good if we got better at doing it as a culture. It seems that it might be running aground more often than it used to these days. I'm super excited to have you, and you talk about your mission is to promote forgiveness in every willing heart, home, and homeland. And so I'd love for you to just kind of frame that vision of forgiveness and the way it moves from the individual to the kind of more intimate relationships to the homeland. Like, how do the kind of fractures and challenges as a psychological scientist, do you see them, I don't know, kind of like a nesting doll of sorts?
I developed that life mission, which I've kept on with, in 1996, right after my mother had been murdered, and I had the opportunity to go to South Africa and participate briefly with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. And I had been for years a couple therapist. So, that just seemed like, okay, here's the individual, the personal side, the heart, the home, forgiveness with couples, and then now homeland. And so that, put them together for me. I think what happens is we kind of move from an individual level to relationships, and reconciliation starts to be considered there. It might not happen, but it starts to be considered. And forgiveness makes us desire reconciliation. And then once we move to a larger level, then reconciliation, the possibility of it becomes important. And certainly in our culture these days, we could use a lot more forgiveness and reconciliation.
How did you navigate the kind of personal tragedy and encounter with the death of your mother with the kind of theoretical tools as a psychological scientist? Like, how did you come to one first or the other? What was the internal challenge for anyone losing a parent and in a violent act is going to be a hard thing to process?
I felt very blessed because I had worked with couples for years and had actually done research on forgiveness for about 6 years, and then had even written a book with a couple of guys who were graduate students with me. And at that point, then all of a sudden, my mother gets murdered, and the game changed. It can't change from being applied in a kind of a day-to-day way versus, oh, here is a big event and I really have to deal with it. And it's kind of rocked my world. So that's kind of the way things developed. I was prepared by the research and practice to start thinking about how do I apply this in my life. I think for many people, they haven't necessarily had that kind of preparation, and all of a sudden they get hit with a big event in their life. So I think that's very hard for them. It was hard for me, and I think it's really hard without preparation, and you just have to deal with this cold turkey.
Mm-hmm. That kind of, I don't know, crucible of sorts where all of the kind of things you've been working with others in a counseling setting and then come home. You had a kind of back-to-back tragedies when you lost your brother as well. And yet the experience of it, because of just the nature of their deaths, was different. And the struggle of processing it was different. So can you kind of help us understand what the differences between their deaths and the way it showed up as something for you to tackle internally?
My mother was murdered in a home invasion on a New Year's Eve night, and apparently a young man broke in thinking no one was home and brutally murdered her. So I had to deal with that, kind of resentment and hate that just rose up in me. My brother actually discovered the body of my mother. He lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, where she lived. I live in Richmond, Virginia, so, we went down there, but that was 7-hour travel. Anyway, Mike had seen this horrid scene firsthand, and so he was dealing with kind of a post-traumatic stress disorder, I believe, that hung on for years after that. And I finally talked with him about it, and I said, Mike, if you're having such trouble dealing with this, you probably need to see a counselor. Well, Mike didn't think much of counselors. I am his big brother, and I am a psychotherapist. So, so his response was, well, I'm not going to any shrink. And I'm like, yeah, right. And so I tried again, Mike, if you haven't gotten over this in years, then you probably got to do something different. And he got really angry, and he, points his finger at me and says, I'm not going to any shrink. And, I don't want to hear any more about it. And being at that time a mature 58 probably year old, I responded like a hormone crazed teenager, like, yeah, well, whatever, Mike. And then I didn't bring it up again. And then within 3 months, he had committed suicide. So I felt like I was the wrongdoer here. So that's the difference. It's like forgiving someone else. They did something wrong. I'm kind of on the moral high ground, and I can forgive them out of an altruistic act. But in Mike's death, I felt like, well, I had let myself down. I had let Mike down by not responding in a way that I knew how to respond as a psychotherapist who had had plenty of experience dealing with, resistances from people who didn't want to do things that I thought would help them. But I didn't do that. And so then I had to struggle with the self-condemnation of kind of failing myself and failing Mike.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I know there are, a host of different kinds of tragedies people have, but there's always that kind of cognitive complexity where just who's the victim and who's the offender, and then how does it show up in the relationship, and what does follow-up look like? All of that can be extremely complex. And I wonder, like, when you think of the time you've set with couples and thinking about their relationship and their family, relating to their families of origin and their children and things, are there particular conversations or acts that show up in a similar way of where it just becomes so thick and emotionally charged, it's hard to understand what moving towards forgiveness looks like?
Well, for like couples, they usually come in saying they want to reconcile, they want to work this out. Often they don't mean it. They what they're really thinking in their mind is, we have tried and tried and tried to work this out. We can't, but people have told us that we have to try counseling. And so, okay, we'll give it a shot, but it won't work. And so their mindset is, this is not going to work. And this person that I used to love has hurt me again and again and again, and probably is going to keep hurting me. And I don't want to be in pain anymore. And so I think that self-protective urge of, I've been hurt, I don't want to be in pain, and then responding back either out of kind of fear and avoidance or out of the best defense is a good offense, and so I'm going to attack them. Those two ways of dealing with, the hurt really, I think, are commonalities in almost any misunderstanding that where people get hurt or offended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our friend Sari, who sent me a lot of your work before this call, you draw a distinction between decisional and emotional forgiveness. And I found that extremely helpful in trying to just process, the kinds of things my partner and I talk about, and thinking about the way we relate to our family, that it's getting at a gap a lot of people experience, that it really wasn't until reading it I was like, oh, well, this is what Everett read my mind. Now I'll be able to articulate it. So I'd love for you to kind of unpack that for us.
Yeah, I pretty much saw in my own experience that there were two different types of forgiveness. People like to think they're two halves of forgiveness, but they're not really. It turns out when we get into the science of it, they're very weakly related to each other, and most people have one but not the other. So one of them is called a decision to forgive, or decisional forgiveness, and that's to make a decision to not pay the person back, but to treat them as a valued and a valuable person. And I can make a decision like that, and I can actually carry that out for the rest of my life. But every single time I think about it, I get upset emotionally, and I feel resentful or bitter or hate even. And that suggests there has to be a second type of forgiveness, and that's emotional forgiveness, where we replace the negative, unforgiving emotions like resentment and hate and anger with positive, other-oriented emotions like empathy or compassion or even love in a romantic relationship where people have hurt each other. Love often is the emotion that replaces the negative emotions.
So when you start to examine that scientifically, like a lot of people might, especially people of faith, hesitate, right, to put, I don't know, the encounter with grace and forgiveness under a microscope. But that distinction is really helpful. So I wonder, like, what is happening maybe physiologically when that emotional forgiveness remains elusive if the individual is like militant about their decision, right? What have you discovered in trying to, in drawing that distinction and then investigating it?
I think from a Christian standpoint, and I think really even other religions, decisional forgiveness is very fundamental. And, for Christians, that's what people are called to do, is to make a decision to treat the person differently. I'm going to restrain myself from just jumping in and paying them back. Well, that involves a part of my frontal cortex that, allows us to do the hard thing when the hard thing is the right thing to do. But also, the other part of that is to treat them more positively. And that's another part of the frontal cortex called the behavioral activating system that draws us to engage with people. But emotional forgiveness, is not really something that any religion requires. It's desirable for sure to emotionally forgive, but it's not really required of people in a religious sense or even a philosophical sense. So, because emotions, as Freud said, never lie, and emotions never lie still. And so if a person is going to hurt us again and again and again, I can make a decision every time to treat them differently and not to respond back negatively. But I can't control my emotions. They're not going to lie still for me, and they're going to build up. The more that I get hurt, they're just going to keep piling up, and it's going to be harder and harder to control emotions. So experiencing emotional forgiveness is desirable, but it's not really required in any really philosophical or religious system.
When you think of like the decisional side being present, but the emotional side not being, what does it look like in intimate relationships, be it within family or breakdowns in faith communities where that kind of thing happens, all the way to the breakdown within a country like South Africa where you put time there? Like, how do you decide when you don't have both present, at what point something intentional or maybe strategic has to be done, because the presence of someone you've decided to forgive is constantly generating emotional turmoil and a kind of distancing or aggressive behavior?
I think the solution to that is in recognizing that reconciliation and forgiveness are different animals. Forgiveness happens inside of us. It's an emotional response. It's a decision, but it's happening inside my skin. But reconciliation happens between people. So I can make a decision to forgive, but I can still socially, pursue justice. And I can pursue accountability and responsibility, and I can, if worse comes to worse, and I'm going to just be, if my partner wants to kill me, I can say no. I don't want to interact with that person because it is not safe. It's not prudent to interact. So I think making that distinction helps us see that we can have an internal experience that's good for us, and it's good actually probably for the other person too, but it's definitely good for us psychologically, physically, spiritually, relationally, but still, I can pursue a social solution that is the best that I can come up with for the whole group, whatever the group is, a twosome or a society.
Mm-hmm. So you have a number of acronyms, which, as a former full-time clergy, an acronym is like halfway done with your sermon. And so I'd love for you to talk about the REACH acronym and say a little bit about each letter, but what kind of introduce us to it, but then also, how did you decide to investigate it? Like, what is it like, not just to say something where if you hear it, you're like nodding your head, like, that makes sense. That would be useful. But then to go, well, is it useful? And doing the kind of psychological studies of its application to demonstrate it.
So first, I'll just kind of name the 5 steps to emotional forgiveness. So remember, the core of this method is to experience emotional forgiveness first, to lower the negative emotions so that people can get to the place where they can make a decision to treat the person differently. So I can do those 2 things in either order. So R is to recall the hurt. So I've got to face up to the fact that I've been hurt. I can't deny it and expect it to just go away. E, I have to emotionally replace the negative with the positive, and the key that we start with is E, empathy. So I want to try to get into the frame of reference. Why did this person do this? Sometimes that's just impossible. I just can't empathize with something. And so I can emotionally replace the negative by using compassion for this person who needs forgiveness or some kind of non-possessive love. So R, recall the hurt. E, empathy. A, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, an altruistic gift, and one that's not deserved. The person doesn't deserve forgiveness because they hurt me. So this is out of the goodness of a person's heart. C, commit to the forgiveness that you experience. And so people do things like just write a contract to themselves that I forgave so-and-so on such and such a day. And the reason people do that is because that helps them, H, hold on to that forgiveness whenever they doubt that they forgive. And we often do doubt it. Just imagine that I've spent a weekend working on a workbook to trace people through REACH, forgiveness, and then make a decision to forgive. And I think, okay, I've forgiven my boss, who is a jerk. And he can't help himself, or she can't help herself. It's endemic to them. I walk into work on Monday morning, I see my boss, and boom, I feel like these feelings have all come back. What happened? I thought I'd forgiven. Well, it turns out I have forgiven, and those emotions are really just my body's way of protecting me. My body's way of saying, hey, you've been hurt here many times. You have to be careful. And so those emotions are not loss of forgiveness. Those emotions are a natural warning system with your body. So that's why people have to, H or C, commit to the forgiveness they've experienced so that they can H, hold on when they doubt that they have forgiven.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things about that approach that showed up in the literature is both the workbook style, right? Like where you're working through it at your own pace, and what it looks like in a small group setting where you do it over, 6 kind of hour session type things. And you ended up comparing that context to like more traditional individual therapy and kind of Christian version of it and such. Can you talk about what it was like to kind of step back after developing something like that to go, well, how do we assess it in these different formats? And then what does what do you understand from the assessment that kind of you point to as like, oh, well, this is what we've identified that allows a kind of comparison between modes?
So this is kind of complex. I do science because it's a habit. I guess I've just done science. I can't kick the habit. And so, as soon as we start to feel like, okay, I think we have something that has worked in the counseling room, I need to treat it a little more rigorously here and investigate it using scientific methods. And so by now, over 30 randomized controlled trials have been done on the groups model of forgiveness. And then we've developed this do-it-yourself workbook, and we had this one giant trial in 5 countries in China, in Indonesia, Ukraine, Colombia, and South Africa, with almost 4,600 people going through those workbooks. And that's more people that got treatment for forgiveness than all other studies of forgiveness put together, mine plus everybody else's. So it's a huge study. There was a randomized controlled trial. So it's kind of the highest level of trial. And so, like I say, out of habit, I want to develop an evidence-based way of approaching this that people can use. And so we've looked at it with Muslims, we've looked at it with Hindus, we've looked at it, with people who are just absolutely non-religious and just don't, the nuns, as they're called, NES, and the duns, the people who used to be religious but said, I'm done with it. So, so we've tried to, see culture by culture as much as possible. Can we investigate that it works? And it's not just us, but, I've been involved in about half of those studies on forgiveness. Other people that, just pick the method up and they study it in their culture, in their system, and it works regardless. So I think the key of this reach forgiveness method is that it works for people who are not clinically disturbed by the offense. So it's not something targeted at people who have experienced incest or abuse from an intimate partner. This is like all comers. And it does include, there have been studies on people who have been clinically diagnosed. There's one study that looked at people diagnosed and under treatment for borderline personality disorder. There's another study with people diagnosed with anxiety disorders and depression. So it works clinically, but my target has been give this away to everybody, anybody in the world. And that big do-it-yourself workbook on forgiveness is available free in English, Spanish, Chinese, Standard Chinese, Portuguese, Ukrainian. It's free on a website available to probably at least 2/3 of the world in their first language. So that's been my heart, to give psychology away.
Mm-hmm. And we'll make sure to be linking to these resources on the post for those of you listening. The place when I was reading through your work that, where you have this temptation of all of a sudden entering your counseling space as opposed to preparing for an interview is when you started talking about the process of responsible self-forgiveness. Because like forgiving oneself is often more complex than forgiving others. Even if the scale of violation is less, the way you relate to yourself can often be more demanding, intense, and hard. And so I wonder if you could kind of help us think through that the kind of 6-step protocol for responsible self-forgiveness. And I mean, I found it helpful just reading it while intentionally trying not to go there, because then I'm like, well, I will come back to this after we do the interview. But it's a big affirmation, but walk us through that.
Sure. Yeah, I think forgiving ourselves is hard because the temptation is always to be easy on ourselves, to let ourselves off the hook. Oh yeah, I've robbed 20 banks, but I'm going to forgive myself, no problem. That doesn't go over with anybody, and so.
Well, see, if you got a Calvinist enough upbringing, it's the other side that you like to give yourself an even harder time. And
well, there's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what I thought we needed to do for responsible self-forgiveness is to kind of address, first go to God. Now when people aren't religious, they feel like sometimes, and remember, we self-forgive for a wrongdoing usually that we have done. And so they like, well, I've done a crime against humanity or a crime against nature. And so whatever people hold to be sacred, whether it's, God or whatever, then they try to make it right by taking the offense to that and trying to get some resolution, some peace on that. The second part is to try to make amends for the things that I've done to the degree that I can. I can't always make amends. When my brother committed suicide, I couldn't really make amends. He was dead. And so that really was a strong deterrent for me at first to be able to feel like I can responsibly forgive myself. But it turned out he left a suicide note asking me to help his wife, with their finances. And that gave me something to do to make amends. The third step, besides going to God, making the social aspects more right, is to try to deal with the psychological impact that I have had by doing this. So for some people, this is that they feel like they've inflicted a moral injury on themselves. They've done something that's against their morals, or they've, seen somebody do something wrong and they haven't done anything about it. So trying to do that and giving a good faith effort. I don't have to get to zero. I don't have to be perfect in this, but I have to give it a good faith effort. And at that point, then I can go to the fourth step, which is to try to apply that reach forgiveness model to myself and walk myself through the REACH emotional forgiveness steps, and then make a decision to forgive myself in the same generosity that I would give to somebody else who did this. The problem then becomes often even more difficult than forgiving myself, and that is to deal with the idea that I didn't think I was the kind of person to do this. I thought I was more mature than this. Here I am, going whatever to my to my brother, when he's needing help, and it's like, I didn't think I was that kind of person. I thought I was mature enough, experienced enough that I could get past that adolescent competitiveness that we had in our relationship, and so that requires self-acceptance. And I sometimes almost joke and say that, well, self-acceptance is like the cornerstone of psychotherapy. It's like, everybody has self-acceptance problems. They go to a therapist, and the therapist helps them do that. And then the last step in that 6 is to try not to do this again. I say to try to live virtuously. That's pretty grandiose, but certainly I don't want to mess up in the same way that I've done before. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes and have other things to deal with. And so we've got go to God, we've got to handle the psychological problems, we've got to handle the social problems, apply the reach forgiveness to yourself, deal with self-acceptance, and then try not to make the same mistake again.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I at least showed up, I was full-time clergy for 15 years before switching to teaching and stuff. One of the things that showed up regularly was were individuals coming, vocalizing their anger, but anger, often is like the fire, but you have to figure out what the wood is that's burning. And oftentimes it's like the absence of forgiveness, be it for the self or for someone else and such. And what do we know about that transition that helps people transition from kind of like tending to like feeling guilty or overwhelmed or frustrated or thriving in kind of like the fire of anger about something to the kind of decision that helps one reorient their relationship either to themselves or others, where you aren't fueling a fire. of kind of burning anger and resentment?
Well, of course, we would never just kind of jump into this with somebody. But what we try to do in that Reach Forgiveness protocol is to lead them to a place where they consider that they've hurt people in the past, and that they can see that, well, that's a human thing that we do, is we hurt people intentionally sometimes, but often not intentionally. And so can you then perhaps empathize with this other person? Can you feel that sense of humility, that sense of, I'm not perfect. I would like to have a generous response from others when I mess up. Can I be equally generous and when they've messed up? So, or can I be generous to myself if it's self-forgiveness? Why am I going to keep being down on myself? If this were somebody else, I would forgive them. Can I apply that same thing to myself?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the concepts you talked about was the injustice gap. And it's one of those that is naming something that has many varieties of the way it shows up. But, broadly, it's where we run around with our computing mechanism of counting violations and then assessing our own and then, keeping score of sorts. But I'd love for you to kind of both kind of help us understand that natural tendency among us, and then what does the kind of scorekeeping ultimately undermine within relationships of love and with a desire for flourishing.
The injustice gap is kind of I think a very common response. We have a need for justice and a need to see justice. And that's just part of, I think, being created in the image of God is to have that built into us. And so I automatically start to compute, how bad was this? How unjust was this? Did the person bump me on the street? Oh, well, that's, an inch worth of injustice. Did the person, abuse me again and again and again? Oh, well, that's, 20-foot high fence of injustice. So that we then just kind of keep a running tab on that. Did the person, when I said, hey, it hurt my feelings when you beat me up, and the person goes, hey, life is full of little, inconveniences, isn't it? And all of a sudden, my injustice gap, which was, not too great, is suddenly very great because they've just offended me again. But if I said the same thing to them, it hurt my feelings, and they said, oh my gosh, this is terrible, I'm so sorry, and they cry, and I think, that's good. And my injustice gap goes down, and they say, can I do anything to make up for what I did to you? Can I give you $1 million? And I'm like, I'd take the edge off, I guess. And you said, we're kind of lowering that sense of injustice, so that fence, which initially may have looked 10 feet high, and I may have thought I could never get over that fence of injustice. But by seeing these ways that people could reduce the size of that injustice gap, or ways that I can do to reduce that size. Like I could take this to God. I could just relinquish it to God. I could appeal to God for divine zapping on the other person. There's all kinds of options for lowering the size of the injustice gap to get it down to the place where I think, okay, well, I could forgive that amount of injustice because I've seen this other stuff done that reduced the size of the injustice gap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful. One of the things you mentioned earlier is that your career started in marriage settings and family counseling, and then was worked out into other areas beyond that. And you've spent time developing exactly how the REACH method works in the family context, where you talk about hope-focused counseling. Since we've already kind of discussed the method broadly, can you kind of turn back to the family unit, and what are the particular nuances or pressure points that show up when trying to work it out in that context?
Yeah, in a family setting, of course, you have the problem, the joy and the problem that we live with this person, and so, or this family, and so we see them all the time, and we interact in so many different ways that we risk getting hurt again and again. And so much of life is mundane, where we're just taking care of business. It seems like sometimes that forgiveness is not that important because, hey, we talk about it once in a month, but we're paying bills and doing all the other problem solving we have to do in the family the rest of the month. So I think, seeing forgiveness in the context of an ongoing relationship, it helps us if we can kind of stop and consider, forgiving explicitly instead of thinking, I'm too busy, this'll go away. It probably won't go away on its own. I will still have resentments if I've been hurt, especially repeatedly. So I think, it's particularly hard in a way in a family because of the just normal proximity, and because of the few interactions we really have explicitly about forgiveness, but the large majority of interactions we have that aggravate us, and the little aggravations. And so what happens, according to couple therapists like John Gottman, is relationships have a predictable way that they tend to deteriorate. And so, at first, we feel kind of criticism. Either my wife says something, my wife wouldn't do this, but, theoretically speaking, a wife might or a husband might just kind of levy a criticism. And at first they criticize kind of in their mind, and then they criticize out loud. And then third, they tend to criticize to other people. So my husband does such as, or my wife does such as. Well, the natural response to that is defensiveness. And so at first, I defend myself in my mind, and then I defend myself back in conversation, and then I start defending myself even though, my friend doesn't realize why I'm defending myself. I'm defending myself to somebody else. And then in this way that relationships deteriorate, there is a break in which, instead of talking about a particular offense that I'm defensive about, I start to generalize and respond with contempt to my partner. And, it's not what she did or what he did that is bad. It's who he is or what he is or she is. And that's where it was going downhill, but suddenly it falls off of a cliff. And that leads to what John Gottman calls either war, which is just continual fighting, or what he calls stonewalling, where I just, basically break emotionally with my partner, and I just stop interacting with the partner. And that, in this day and age, that more and more is a common solution, where I'm just going to cancel this person. I'm just going to cut them off. I'm not going to deal with them. Yeah, it's my family that raised me, but yeah, they offended me, and so I'm going to have nothing to do with them. That's that last fourth stage of relationship disillusion. And so the trick, and it's not a trick, but the key in couple therapy or family therapy is to try to help people move back up that cascade down into disillusion step by step. You can't just, all of a sudden, repair all the damage that's been done, but step by step move back up to the contempt, and then up to defensiveness, then up to criticism, and then let's just stop criticizing.
Mm-hmm. And what you the hope model, you talk about handling our problems effectively. Like what does that look like when you're in the lower stages versus, say, you've gotten to a kind of reconciliation and something comes up, and then you're like, oh, we know the routine. Here's how we handle this.
Yeah, the two halves of that hope-focused approach. The first half is, as you said, handling our problems effectively. That involves talking about how do we communicate effectively, how do we resolve conflicts effectively, how do we manage our intimacy effectively. And then the other part is what we call free, or forgiveness and reconciliation through experiencing empathy. And then that's about, how do we repair the relationship? So, I think we practice living together, and we're just, practice puts our brain to sleep. Literally puts our brain to sleep. They've done studies on rats to show that when they learn a maze, their brains are very active at the first, but as they practice that maze more and more, their brain waves look exactly like they're asleep. And, and that's what habits do. And so when we practice fighting with each other and communication conflict strategies that are not helpful, or cutting people off intimately, or not forgiving, and when we practice those things, they become very easy to continue to do. And it takes a lot of effort to stop and break that up, and let's re-engage the brain, and let's do something different until that becomes a habit. And then now I'm, habitually, communicating well, resolving conflicts productively, and being intimate and forgiving.
Mm-hmm. And part of it is you talk about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and how reconciliation it involves that more intentional process of restoring trust.
And restoring trust is like the key to reconciliation. And that, of course, requires that both people be giving a good faith effort to be trustworthy. So if one person is not going to try to be trustworthy, reconciliation is probably not going to happen. I love a little quote by John Paul Lederach, a peace worker at Notre Dame. And he says, you can't build a bridge by starting in the middle. Both sides have to start from their shore and work toward the center, and don't think about whether I'm going 51% towards the other side, but they're only going 49%. The idea is to get a bridge that you both can walk over together. So I love that. I've been really writing about the last 6 months reconciliation a lot, and kind of developed a half-baked theory of reconciliation, in which I look at, kind of the way that it's a complex process that we just can't predict what's going to happen. I mean, we can see that as we look at the news, with all these people trying to, work out reconciliations across countries. You can't predict what's going to happen. So it's a complex adaptive process. And it also involves an idea of that events happen in waves. Bad stuff happens, and then that triggers more bad stuff, and that triggers more bad stuff, and then it kind of plays out. And then, good stuff happens, and good stuff and good stuff, and they feed into each other. And what I have to know as a person experiencing the reconciliation, is that if I've got a plan for how we can build this bridge, we're going to have crises. We're going to have the crisis du jour. And I have to keep in mind that we have to solve the crisis du jour, but we want to do it in the context of that overall plan that's going to get us across that bridge, and not just get swept up in this fuss today, this fuss tomorrow, this fuss the next day. So, I think reconciliation is really complex. We have a method of helping couples that we call free. It takes them through some steps to reconciling. But again, having done this for years, you can't predict what's going to happen. You can offer people to walk through the steps and things can blow up at any point. Or you think it's falling apart and suddenly they come in and they go, hey, we're done with counseling. We reconciled and this is great. And you're like, wow, that was magic. I didn't do a thing.
Well, I wonder what kind of observations do you have just about the way in which our culture and the public square is changing? You mentioned earlier, right? Like how quick people could be to cancel members of their family or half the country, or, in these kinds of situations where the orientation and more parts of our lives seems to be increasingly aggressive. And that kind of aggression is really not built for, the kind of deep, trusting relationships needed to bond a family or friend group, or to bond a country to deal with whatever the different challenges that show up.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, like everybody else, I can kind of throw my hands up and go, well, what can we do about this? And I'm not sure that anybody has good answers about what to do. And there's a lot of blame that we can cast about what caused it. Certainly we are in a place where we tend to cast more and more people as an out group, and then want to withdraw into my in group. And that I think that by just interacting with my in group, things will be great. Well, they're not going to be great, because the out groups are out there, and there are so many out groups that we might have that they're not going to go away. And so we've lost the idea of the contact hypothesis, which says that if we work together on projects, then we will tend to, be able to deal with our differences more productively than if we stay apart and imagine that the other group is somehow evil incarnate and there's nothing good about them. But our group is very differentiated. We're all individuals, They're all alike, the out group is, but we are all different and complex and wonderful people. And, when we stop interacting with people because we've kind of canceled them out and relegated them to an impermeable out group, then we're never going to learn that they are just as complex and wonderful as we are, and they're just as flawed and fallen as we are. So I think, that's clearly one of the keys to solving this. How do you get them? How do you get people to do that? Well, I don't know. We need another Martin Luther King. We need people like Nelson Mandela that can somehow call people together who have different visions, and yet this person, can unify people into a vision that is greater than themselves. So, but, I don't know who that's going to be.
Well, yeah, I resonate with a lot of what you're saying. And one of the things that I've been increasingly worried about, I remember when I was in Edinburgh, I was teaching the science and religion second half of the intro class on the biological and psychological sciences. We're doing the contact theory stuff. And you would think you get done with that and take any of the identity politic issues going on in, the Church of Scotland, and you have these future ministers sitting there, and you're like, oh, you mean just having a friend of a friend is more effective at changing someone's mind than, I don't know, top-down authority changing their bathroom signs? And you're like, yeah, and if you're the Trust the Science group, we might want to try this, right? Like, one of the gifts, I think, of psychological science is to help us understand exactly what is our inheritance as a species. And if you think that we're made in the image of God, then there's something significant about getting to understand who we are. And it also sets up a thinking, there are some odd experiments we're running writ large right now about human beings. When you think of the examples you just gave of, our tribe, we notice all the unique features of it, and the others are all the same. Well, that is our tendency of us on our worst days. And now everyone's walking around with a phone, monetizing their anxiety, leveling up their tribalism so that it can market to them random things to fit, to quick fixes why it takes their money to their worst fears about themselves or self-judgments, right? Like the idea that we're doing the kind of sorting that eliminates the friction of difference algorithmically, and we're doing the same thing in our family and friend groups, in our churches. One of the biggest changes in American religion over the last 60 years is the self-sorting, not just we've switched on, you'd rather your kid marry someone from another religion than a different political party, and congregations now, I talk to hundreds of ministers who feel pressured, regardless of what kind of political persuasion their congregation is, to be more political and to purify their church, right? Like the presence of the other is problematic. And so to me, there's a need to introduce the psychological science, not just around forgiveness, but what actually inhibits it, and go, do we want to, at least for me as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus, do you want to use a technology, that invites you to judge the other in the most sweeping, dismissive way? And do you want to only feel safe to worship the God of love and grace when you've already self-sorted yourself to probably the same race, class, answer to identity politics thing, and we vote the same, right? To me, that seems like an experiment we're running that we never asked whether it was an ethical one or not, and are watching some of the consequences.
Yeah, good observations. Our little congregation of about 100 adults is just wonderful from my point of view because it is very non-self-sorted. We are politically all over the place. We are, ethnically all over the place. And, to be just the joy of being in a congregation where you believe, the similar core, and yet you have all these differences that are put in perspective, I think, is a joy. I think, as I was thinking about what I said earlier, there's what I call three kinds of diplomacy that reconciliation involves. The first is, and only psychologists and social scientists can come up with names like this, but there's track one psychology now, isn't that sophisticated? Or track one diplomacy. But that's things that leaders can do. They can declare ceasefires, they can encourage people to do things. This is the Mandela. But that is not sufficient in itself to build reconciliation. That helps, but it's not sufficient. As we can see, as we look at how well ceasefires work, politically today. But track two diplomacy is when you can get the local leaders together and get them to hear each other's story. So this is the contact hypothesis. This is where you get people to hear the other person going through the similar human things and you build empathy. I think that's not sufficient either. I think we need a track 3 diplomacy in which the leaders go back into their groups and share the things that they've learned and try to promote forgiveness and reconciliation within local bodies instead of, the grand societal. I think the society will be built up of a whole bunch of local bodies. So, I think that's where the reconciliation probably needs to go, is those track 1, track 2, track 3 diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really helpful. All right. So there's one other thing that once I started looking stuff up and then I started downloading things you wrote is your kind of study of humility and virtue. And you talk about heroic humility, which in our culture that, we've been talking about, that tends to value loud egos and hyperbolic ids and, most likely half your pictures of yourself. So it's someone who's thinking about the psychological science and thinking about the kind of flourishing, right, between yourself and your home and the homeland and this kind of thing. What does virtue look like, and what does it mean to intentionally cultivate it? And I know as a parent, I will be sitting here ready, to make notes of it.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to, and we all have a picture of virtue. Our pictures can differ dramatically, but I think we try to live into what we think is, virtue, whether it's, I think beating up someone or, being bigoted, that's virtuous. Well, no, it's not. It's not a true picture of virtue. But I think the classic virtues, the fruit of the Spirit in Christianity, the 4 cardinal virtues in, Greek philosophy, those virtues have stood the test of time. And I think the idea of that is to be able to get to a place where we can practice those. Virtue is not something we set as a poster on the wall and think that, okay, well, I'm going to be more virtuous. We have to practice it day in and day out. So, over the course of the last 20 years or so, we've created a bunch of self-help books, that are workbooks. They're free on my website, but to build humility, to build forgiveness, to build patience, to build positivity. I'm not sure that's a virtue, but it's certainly a good thing to feel. So, I think working through, individual instances where I see how to, build humility on a particular thing I'm struggling with, or how to build patience on a particular thing I'm struggling with, and then applying that to another thing that I'm struggling with, and another, and another. And at some point, I feel like my brain has gone to sleep in a very positive, virtuous way, and I'm actually living more virtuously than I was before. So I think that's what we have to do, is to approach it intentionally, practice it until it becomes second nature.
Mm-hmm. And could you say a bit about the prove model for developing humility? I know that to me that was something I could imagine using to help, function in a small group, or talking with your young adolescent children or young adults, or in a smaller group setting, to kind of collectively practice of hopefully a shared virtue among your family or community of faith, like humility.
Yeah, naturally, that's been almost 10 years since I've done that workbook, so I can't remember what the PROVE.
Oh, it's pick a time is the P. Remember the place. So R, open yourself. Then the V is value all things. And then E is examine your limitations.
And so I think, without going through that, I think that humility it's about, one, realizing I am not the greatest. I am not Muhammad Ali. I can't beat him. And I in anything, I have limitations, but I also want to do positive things, being humble is about putting others, above yourself, not in a way that's pathological where I am a doormat and everybody's going to walk on me, but rather to treat others as valued and valuable people. And so I think there are two sides to the humility. There are things I don't want to do. I don't want to be self-aggrandizing. I don't want to be bragging and just turning people off. But there are things that I do want to do, and that's to lift others up, instead of putting them down. And I think if we have in mind those two things as a general strategy, then, living that out is just going to challenge us for the rest of our lives, because the natural tendency is to lift myself up, not acknowledge my limitations, and make myself first, not other people. So it's going to be a challenge, but virtue is hard. If it were easy, everybody would do it, and we don't.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about it in the reading is the way in which the cultivating a practice of humility has both positive effects for oneself, right? Like in having greater self-acceptance and forgiveness and these kinds of things. You're more likely to be trusted with leadership and all this kind of stuff. But it also has these other perks, especially if you're a leader or a parent or whatever, that it allows those you have intimate relationships with to be more forgiving to themselves, to be more honest in where disagreement shows up, and that the virtue of humility in many ways is like a lubricant for the actual friction between people to be present without judgment. And when you think back to like some of the stuff you were talking about before about these breakdowns and reconciliation, part of it is we want our experience to have less and less friction, which ends up filtering out and all the things about the fullness of our humanity. And so the perks of it that you laid out were just encouraging to go like, maybe the inherited patterns of Southern masculinity are actually undermining the moral formation of my children. If, when that older version creeps out, it has consequences, not just for me.
Yeah, it's well said. I'm reminded of, and this is going to be a tangent you might even want to take out of this, but
I like tangents.
I'm reminded of a study that was done way back, turned into a book by Dove Cohen and Richard Nisbet at University of Michigan. You may have heard of this, but they were studying honor culture, the Southern honor culture. And so they took, Michigan guys in University of Michigan who were born and raised in Michigan and compared them to people who were going to the University of Michigan but had been born and raised in the South. And so they created this study in which they had people fill out some questionnaires, and then, these are, the two groups of guys, and then they sent them down to the other end of the hall to turn in the questionnaires and pick up some other questionnaires. And so as they leave the room, there is this guy who is blocking the hallway, and he's got a big pile of books on a cart, and he's standing there, and he actually was a bouncer at a local club, and he's like born to be wild. He's big, he's huge, he's intimidating, and so they looked at how did people get past him, because he was going to resist them. He's a Confederate, the experimenter. And so they go up and they found the different strategies for that honor culture, Southern, and I was raised in the South, so honor culture, or the Michigan guys. And, the Michigan guys are, joking and, anyway, the Southern guys are like a little more confrontive, and they start out really mild, but they get a little more confrontive, and then finally the guy is aggravated, the bouncer, and so he calls them a name. It was a name that they had researched to be the most offensive name that they could call the people. And I can't say that name, but it rhymes with bass pole. So at any rate, he calls them this name, and then he lets them by. And so they go down and they turn in the questionnaires, they pick up the others, and they come out again, and he's back in the hall again, blocking the way. And now the measure is how close do the people get to him? And so the Michigan guys stopped on the average 6 feet away. And it's like, excuse me, can I get by? I need to get by again, The Southern guys, raised in the South, but going to Michigan, stopped on the average. You have to imagine, this is on the average now, 6 inches from the guy. They're like right up in his face. I need to get by. And we wonder about that honor culture. And that honor culture is not just the American South, but it's all over the world. But it is it can be a very provocative culture, when people disagree about something.
I know. I don't even doubt that that's a true story, just based on my own personal experience. And
it's research in action.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes you don't need it verified intimately. This has been a whole lot of fun.
I enjoyed it.
Do you want to let people know where your website is, and I'll make sure to link to everything on the post with this.
Yeah, my personal website, where all the free books are, is www.evworthington-forgiveness.com. So EVWOR, no spaces, evworthington-forgiveness.com. And if you want those little workbooks on forgiveness, that is at Templeton World Charity Foundation site that you can put in the HTTPS :// and then reach.discoverforgiveness.org. So that's an org rather than a .com.
Awesome. This has been great. Thank you so much. This is
I've enjoyed
quite
it.
A treat.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Trip. Yeah.